Hello and welcome to the first Symposion produced podcast where a couple of students talk with a professor about a non-philosophical topic of interest to that professor. And in this first episode, we talk with Victor Gijsbers about interactive fiction. Just a quick heads up before we get into the actual podcast. We had 2/3 of the way through, we had some technical difficulties regarding our microphones, so the audio quality from my side and Lotte's side will drop a bit since we had to use the Zoom audio recording for that part of the podcast. It is still understandable though, so hopefully it won't be too much of a bother to you. We had a lot of fun talking with Victor Gijsbers, and I hope you have a lot of fun listening. Let's get on with it. So my name is Sven.
My name is Lotte.
And we are here with...
Victor Gijsbers.
Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show and for this inaugural episode. I am extremely flattered.
Good.
It's an honor.
Yeah, we are very happy that you're here. And the two of us, I think I can speak for the two of us, that we are very excited to talk with you about the topic that you have proposed, which is interactive fiction. Can you maybe describe to the listeners what is interactive fiction?
Yes, of course. So interactive fiction is, well, as the name implies, it's two things, right? It is fiction and it is interactive. And so there's a story being told, but you are not just like the passive reader of the story as you would be when reading a novel, although maybe the reader of a novel is not that passive, but at the very least, you're not influencing the story being told. In an interactive fiction, you have to take a more active role, right? You have to do something. Maybe you have to click on links. Maybe you have to make decisions. Maybe you have to type in stuff that gets incorporated into the story. And so in a broad sense, that is what interactive fiction is. It is fiction that is interactive. But usually when we use the term, we use it for something that's a little bit more precise than that, a little bit more limited than that. Because what I've just been saying, I guess, something like Cyberpunk 2077, like these big AAA computer games, I mean, they're fiction and they're interactive, right? So we normally use the term interactive fiction to talk specifically about texts, right? So these would be computer games that are in the form of text, maybe with some images, but primarily in the form of text. Or they could be maybe books that are somehow interactive, but again, primarily in the form of text.
Okay. Yeah, that's
Very interesting.
We've both been... You've sent us a couple of links beforehand, and we've both been playing actually a bit of your own games because you make them. You make them yourself.
Right.
I call them games now, but I probably shouldn't call them games.
No, I never know what to call them. Are they games? Are they stories? I sort of use both,
A little bit of both.
kind of interchangeably. It's like the liminal space in between.
It feels like that as well when you're doing it. There's ones that feel more story-like and ones that feel much more game-like.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I absolutely agree. I played one of your games. Oh my god, I forgot the name again.
We didn't
We
know
both
how to
played the
pronounce
same
it.
one.
Turandot. Is that how you pronounce
I
it?
think so. There is actually I say Turandot. Turandot.
Okay.
It is based very, very loosely on the Italian opera by Puccini, which is probably called Turandot, though there are some people who think that you ought to say Turandot. But okay, so you can go both ways.
Yeah, we'll call it Turandot, seeing as it is
You're the creator. You get creative.
I get to choose.
Freedom.
Authorial intent.
Yeah. But yeah, no, we played that, and that really felt like a story. to be honest. But with the interaction, the fact that you can choose your responses to a certain situation, that makes it almost inherently game-like. The fact that you, as a player, as a reader, it's a little bit of both. You have to choose what you do, what you say, and that feels like a game to me. But other than that, it's almost purely fiction. And I really enjoy
I
it.
think if you look at sort of the origins of interactive fiction in the basically in the 70s, like many of the early works of interactive fiction were much more puzzle-like, right? They were more game-like because they were based around puzzles. You're set in this sort of world and you can walk around it much more freely than in a game like Turandot. Like you have these different locations and you move between these different locations by saying things like, I don't know, go up or go north or things like that. And you can pick up items and then, you come across this locked door or maybe this troll who doesn't want you to cross the bridge or other things that maybe it's totally dark and you need to get a light somewhere. So those were, I would say, very, very much games, although as you progress through them, you are kind of telling a story too, right? The story of walking through this world and doing things in it. But they were very much based on puzzles. And then I think later on, like maybe in the last 15 to 20 years, people have been experimenting much, much more with trying to put the story at the front and game-like elements sometimes taking a back seat.
Yeah, this origin to me sounds a lot like it almost the origin is kind of like a single player Dungeons and Dragons adventure almost, but in text.
I actually think that is really close to what happened.
That is historically very, very, very correct.
Close.
Yes, absolutely. So Dungeons and Dragons was very much on the minds of a lot of these early creators. So actually the very first like interactive fiction game, a game called Adventure, was in part written by a guy called Crowther. And Crowther was, he was a caver. That is somebody who explores caves, right? So he explored caves, and at a certain point, he was also a computer programmer. He decided to sort of recreate this experience of exploring a cave on a computer. And I think he got his daughters to try it out, and they loved it. And so he created this dungeon with dungeon cave, I should say, with a couple of like puzzles and a few like obstacles to overcome. And then he kind of put it on the primitive internet of the time, where it was picked up by a guy called Woods, Don Woods. And Woods had played some Dungeons and Dragons, and he added in a lot of magic and, weird fantasy creatures and like bizarre locations that had nothing to do with a real life cave. And I think it's this expanded version of Adventure that became the main source of inspiration for the generation that comes afterwards for games like Zork or the Scott Adams games, and there's all kinds of little companies actually springing up, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, recreating these text adventures as they were called at the time, very much with a lot of them very much with a sort of Dungeons and Dragons feel, sometimes including randomized combat, generally done very, very badly. But okay, it's there.
Someone had to be the first one to try it, right? You can't start out with something magnificent and completely perfectioned.
Yeah, no, that's true. Although actually Adventure is still a pretty nice game. I recently played it for the first time. So this very first interactive fiction game, and it still holds up pretty well, in part because, this guy who made this, he really knew this cave, and it really sort of feels real. It's really like kind of nice to explore it. But yeah, some of these later games, when they add in combat, it's like, okay, you have the Dungeons and Dragons experience, but not with like the Dungeons and Dragons rule set that actually gives you a lot of options. It's just like, oh, there's a monster. Oh, the computer generated a random number and now you are dead.
Oh, no. Yeah. No, that does take away a bit of the fun and the puzzle aspect, once again, of what could be the best way to go about a certain problem. But I can imagine that if you're just roaming around a cave, it's much more free that way. You can just go somewhere, see what you come across, and it is an adventure in that sense.
Yeah. I watched, you have your own YouTube channel where you analyze some interactive fiction things, and I watched your introduction, and you make the distinction, or the distinction is made, but to me you made it, within interactive fiction being on the one hand you have the more choice based, so you get like choices put in front of you, and it's like, okay, choose one of these choices. Sometimes there's only one choice, sometimes there's a lot of choices. And you have the parser based games, which allow you to type in things. I was wondering, is there any real difference between these two? Because these parser games obviously only understand a very limited amount of commands. So there's essentially, it narrows your choices pretty a lot, because it's like, examine this, go there. In your own game it would be like concentrate or something, but even it's all very limited. So can you still make a difference between choicer and parser, or what do you think?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So I think there is actually, yes, there is an important difference, though it is a fluid difference. And there are actually games that sort of lie a little bit between them. So, you are right, of course, that in a sense, a parser-based game, and just to tell our listeners, if they've never seen this before, what it looks like, you would see something like let's say, this game Adventure, this first interactive fiction game. It basically starts by saying that you are outside in front of a little white building to your east, and there are paths going in all directions. And then that's it. And there's a little blinking cursor, and you can type something, right? And you can type anything. You can type, "Hi, I have no idea what to do, help me," and press enter. And then the computer is going to say, "I didn't understand that." Right? So that doesn't really work.
That is
and
not
of course,
a verb I
it's going to
recognize.
turn out that these parser games only understand a limited amount of syntax and a limited amount of words, right? Basically, what they want you to type is something like go west, or open door, or take the sword, or kill the troll, or something like that. And okay, clearly the number of things that you could type is finite, right? And so it might seem that there's not a real difference between having this parser in which you can type in a finite number of things and having these choices, which is also a finite list. But finite is a pretty big category, right? So 1 is finite, and 1,000 is also finite. And so, first of all, there's a big difference in like the amount of choices that you could see. In a choice-based game, if you give somebody like 10 choices, that is a lot. Just imagine all the time that you spend reading through the choices that you can make, thinking about them, thinking about, which one to choose. That's a very different experience from just having this prompt in front of you and thinking, what shall I type? Right. So that's one difference. Like the amount of choices in a parser-based game is still going to be much bigger than in a choice-based game. Second, a choice-based game is going to make all its choices explicit to you. Right? There can't be anything hidden. There can't be anything that you didn't think of, because it's right there on the screen in front of you. In the parser-based game, you don't know what the space of possibilities is. Right? You don't know which words the computer is going to understand, which kinds of actions the computer is going to understand. So there's something hidden about it. And this can sometimes lead to incredible frustration because you want to do something, but you don't know how to tell it to the computer. Or you don't know that you can do something because the game has never sort of hinted at you that this might be a possible course of action. And so, in fact, a lot of the skill that you need when designing a parser game is assuring that that kind of stuff doesn't happen. So it can cause a lot of frustration, but it also generates possibilities for, wow, having this moment of insight, for instance, right? Whoa, maybe this works, and it actually works, right? And so it creates the possibility for a kind of aha moment or a kind of puzzle solving that isn't really possible in choice-based. And so maybe what I should say here at the end is that it tends to lead to two very, very different kinds of storytelling. So parser-based games tend to lead to stories that are very much location-based, because what parser games are really good at is presenting you this world with different locations, letting you walk around in it, and then simulating this world, right? You can do all these things. There is this big openness in how you try to approach things and how you try to do things, and it makes sense for a parser-based game to try and simulate that. Sometimes in simple ways. I mean, you can drop things, and when you get back to a location, they're still there. But already in adventure, there's a bit more going on. So you can pick up treasures, but you can also meet a pirate who is moving around the world, and he can steal those treasures from you and take them to a different place in the world, his lair. And then once you find that lair, hey, that's where you can get back all your treasures. That's the kind of stuff that a parser-based game could be really good at. On the other hand, there are things that parser-based games are really bad at. So one thing that they're really bad at is giving you lots of like non-standard ways to interact with the world. Because every non-standard way to interact with everything that is not just going somewhere, picking something up, opening something, this sort of standard list of maybe 20 or 30 actions, anything that's not that has to be specifically hinted. And so there's no way that you are going to be able to write a parser game, or at least it's going to be very hard to write a parser game where somebody comes to you and says, "Oh, king, the neighboring kingdom is plotting a war against us. What shall we do?" And then you say, well, let's send some spies or build up our army, or, how are you going to communicate those possibilities in a parser game? So that's the kind of thing that a choice-based game would be very, very good at, right? At completely like sort of mixing up and surprising you with all these kinds of things that you can do, all these places where the story can be taken. And so it tends to lead to a very, very different experience.
Yeah, so the main difference wouldn't necessarily be the choices or even amount of choices, but mostly the experience the player has while playing the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
The making of those choices.
Yeah, and so I mean, if I'm speaking for myself, but I think this is probably fairly typical. If I have a game idea for an interactive fiction game, it is like an essential part of the game idea that it is either parser or choice, right? It's not that I have a game idea and then I think, oh, maybe I should do choice, or maybe I should do parser, or I'm a little bit, I don't know which one to choose. It's like, no, this game idea is a parser idea and this game idea is a choice idea.
It's actually interesting that you mentioned that, because a little while ago you said that some games have a little bit of a hybrid format between the two of them. Right now you make it sound like they are completely different formats entirely and they're not really compatible. So how would a hybrid function?
Yeah, so here's one way you could try to set up a hybrid, and some people have done this. They've kind of taken the standard parser vocabulary, like the standard kind of things that you can do with a parser, like what all the parser games understand, going somewhere, picking something up, etc., and sort of turned it into a point and click interface, right? So you click go and then you get all the directions and you click north, or you click pick up and you click the item that you want to pick up, or you click give to and you choose an item and a person to give it to. And so that is like, I guess, strictly speaking, that would be a choice game in the sense that the choices, I mean, you choose from among pre-given options, but it feels a lot like a parser game because it has the same sort of command structure. The one important difference, I guess, being that none of the commands can be hidden. Right? It can't be the case that there is something So, for instance, and I'm not going to name the game because it could be kind of a spoiler, but there is a famous interactive fiction game where you end up in a maze. Like mazes are I would say, almost universally hated part of early interactive fiction games. Like where you have like 20 locations with the same name, and you have to sort of make a map, and it's like horrible.
Yeah, the worst.
But anyway, in this famous game that I'm not going to name, there is a maze. And literally, it's like literally infinite, right? There's no way out of it. There's no way you can map it. But there have actually been some hints, and if you get stuck and keep walking on, the hints are going to become a little bit clearer even. That you may have transformed, like your physical form may have been transformed, and you may now have wings. And so actually, what you have to type is fly. And when you type fly, you sort of just lift off and fly out of the maze. And
the maze no longer
and that's
matters.
pretty amazing, right? I mean, that moment when you understand suddenly that you have this freedom that you didn't realize you had, well, that is something that, okay, I mean, there's a risk. And the risk is that you don't think of this and you get stuck and you have to look at the hints. And you're like, but there's also a potential reward. And that's this amazing feeling of freedom, which is sort of precisely also the content of the story here.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. I must admit, I don't have much experience with text-based games, adventures. I don't really know what to call them myself. I remember last summer I played a little bit of Zork in a video game museum in Berlin. That was very cool. It was like the clearing with the White House. And I remember the moment where I realized that if we went around the corner of the house, there was a window that was slightly crooked and we could enter through that. Like we had been walking around for ages. And that realization, that moment of realization, like this is how we continue, was incredible. And of course, then you come into a whole new area of frustrations and things you have to figure out for yourself. You go up the ladder, it's dark, you can't see anything. I have to go back. And you are likely to be
eaten by a grue. Absolutely. So I think I have been playing Zork this week because basically for the same reason I played Adventure last week, which is that somebody I know quite well is writing a historical series of articles on text games. And he just did Adventure, and then he did Zork. And so I thought, okay. I've tried it a couple of times. I never got very far. Let's try it again. I'm pretty far. But I think sort of the opening area of Zork immediately shows you, yes, it shows you sort of this potential. And you're like, wow, I've entered this world. And this was so, I mean, if you imagine how amazing this must have been in the 70s, right? When nobody had ever basically played, I mean, if they played a computer game, it was... they were extremely primitive things, right? Like you are trying to land a rocket. How much fuel do you want to spend? And you type in 15 and it says, okay, now you're going this fast. How much fuel do you want to spend? Right? I mean, this was like a totally new experience. And so it really embodies that, but it also immediately commits some, like, I would say, really grave sins. I mean, you start out in this forest area and if you try to make a map of it, you're going to find out that if you go north here and then go back south, you end up in a totally different place. And there's no way to make sense of it. And you can spend like an hour trying to understand what this outside area is like, even though there's basically nothing to do there. So it's I mean, these are the kinds of things that in more modern interactive fiction, authors generally try to avoid. And so playing even a parser game from like 2020 is definitely going to feel very, very different from playing a parser game from 1980. That is something I can promise you.
No, I don't doubt it.
Yeah. I was wondering, because you have two related questions. What is it, if you can identify it in the first place, that draws you to interactive fiction? And then what is it that compels you to actually make them yourself?
Yeah, those are very good questions. So let me start by giving you a historical anecdote, which I don't think is really the answer to it. But so when I was little, and we're talking the end of the 80s here, I had this maybe the early 90s, I had this very primitive black and white screen computer. And we didn't have many games on that. But one of the games I had was a Dutch text adventure called Korenvliet. Apparently, though, it's hard to recognize based on the books of Leonard Huizinga, the other and less famous Huizinga. Anyway, I thought it was amazing. I sat there with my grandmother and we tried to walk through this world and solve puzzles, and we never got very far. And many years later, I found it again, hacked the basic code, and found out that we didn't get very far because it was like the worst adventure game ever written. And like you totally had to read the author's mind in order to find out what to type in, and there was no way to actually sort of successfully play it. But I like this sense of walking through a world and trying to understand it. That was very compelling, and it took me until the early 2000s to find out that this stuff still existed. And in fact, that there was an entire renaissance of people sort of making especially parser games at that moment, making parser games. And so I tried out a few of them, and they were amazingly good. I mean, some of them were amazingly bad, but the good ones were amazingly good and did things with the medium that you would maybe never have expected if you were just expecting some more text adventures, like telling really strange stories, using the medium to well, you know, in all kinds of unexpected and artistically interesting ways. And so I think that is in essence what grabbed me, is that there was just so much good stuff. I mean, you're not going to be spending a lot of time playing interactive fiction if there's no good interactive fiction. So that is sort of one thing I can say. And of course, another thing is that, yeah, it appeals to me as a medium because it's such, I don't know. So I love reading books, but playing an interactive fiction game feels totally different. It's like a totally different activity, even though you are reading. And so you have all the joys of text. I mean, I love text and I love all the nuances that you can get in text, which you could not get in the same way generally in like a graphical game, for instance. I mean, I just love text and style and all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, you're sort of continually, well, interacting with it and being drawn in, and you have to do something. I don't know. It's something that feels very good to me. I don't know how to explain it further. It's a kind of reading, a kind of interacting that I really enjoy. So yeah, those two things, and I don't think they're very enlightening. Yeah, and then why would you feel compelled to write something yourself? I think there's, well, again, one thing is that you have an idea, right? And that idea can sort of take you over and become something that you sort of have to write and have to finish. And I like only the ideas that do that are the ones that get finished, because let me tell you, there was 5, 6, 7 years before I came up with the idea of Turandot, and I finished Turandot. And for some of the years I didn't do anything with it, but the idea was still there. And then after a couple of months, it would suddenly, but it's a good idea. I need to do something with it. I need to work it out.
This is so
that's part of it. You need ideas, and to be honest, I have more ideas than I have time to make them. But the other thing is that, again, it is like what I like writing, but I also like programming, which is a sort of totally different part of your brain. I don't know whether it's actually a different part of your brain, but it's certainly a totally different skill set. It's a totally different way of thinking. And interactive fiction is pretty unique in that it allows you to combine those two things, right? All your prose skills and your storytelling skills, but also you need these programming skills and think about the logic of the situation and how you are going to model something. And I love the fact that you can do both. And maybe at some point you're more in the mood for one, and at some point you're more in the mood for the other. And at some point you sort of have to be in the mood for both. It sort of draws on a lot of skills and a lot of aspects of your thinking and your competence. And yeah, that's something that I have a lot of fun doing.
I think in Turandot, the pleasure you take in writing, I think, really comes across as well. It's really a game that focuses on prose mostly, also because I feel like the choices that you actually make are not impactful on the actual story. It is still interactive, so for the people who don't know, of course, it is a story in which you have dialogue options, sometimes multiple, sometimes one, and but most of them, maybe even all of them, won't have an impact on the happenings in the story. So what if? But it's still interactive. It's not like you're reading a book. So in that sense, the experience you have is very different, because it's not
Completely.
When I played it in one evening, and normally if I sit on the couch and read a book, it does feel very different. Why did you decide to make Turandot into a interactive fiction game in which you could show or engage in your prose with interactive options instead of a short story?
Yeah, that's a great question. So maybe if I may, I want to start like one step earlier. I think I like your description of the game is absolutely correct. So one thing that people would think about a lot when you think about like making choices is that it would lead to branches, like branching storylines. Like choose one thing happens, choose something else happens. And you can take this to extremes. Like so one form of interactive fiction that I haven't mentioned yet, but some people might be familiar with it, are these choose your own adventure books. Right? You have these books, and like you read something, and then you can choose to go to the forest or go to the mountains, like that kind of stuff. Yeah. And if you go to the forest, 4. Go to page 40.
Exactly.
And like not all of them, but there is a sort of subgenre of that where your choices like take you every which way, right? If you make one choice on page 1, you end up being on a spacefaring mission to Orion. And if you make another choice on page 1, you end up being in Atlantis or whatever. And like they go everywhere. And every choice makes an extreme impact on what is going on in the story. So, I mean, that is one way to write interactive fiction. But it's pretty extreme, and it might not be very, very interesting. I mean, why would you do that? I mean, do you have, like, if you have 50 stories to tell, why would you sort of want to tie them together as a sort of tree structure? I mean, what's the point of that? I'm not a big fan of that, to be honest. And so I would say most interactive fiction is less extreme than that. Some of it still has like choices that have a serious impact on, for instance, maybe how the story ends. Like there's a gigantic catalog of very recent interactive fiction published by Choice of Games, whose software I've used to write Turandot, but I haven't published with them. But in general, the games that they publish are like that. You have a lot of choices, and they do make an impact. And often you might have sort of different, like your choices make you go this way or that way in the story. And then after a while, it sort of comes back together again. And maybe you have a couple of things like that where it branches for a bit and then comes back together again. And then maybe there are a couple of endings. And of course, these endings are also what in AAA games people are very often talking about. Like, which ending did you get of Dragon Age 14?
Yeah, or The Witcher, or
yeah, absolutely. Oh, The Witcher is like it's so explicit about it, right? It really just it ends up by telling you, oh, this is the ending that you got. And I mean, I love The Witcher 3, but that is a bit over the top, right? And am I really gonna go through the 150 hours of The Witcher again in order to make different choices? I don't think so. Okay, so in Turandot, I mean, Turandot is on the other extreme, maybe. It is, I mean, you do have choices, but they don't really impact how the story goes very much at all. I mean, there are a couple of choices that will come back later. And I mean, you can, for instance, fall into the crocodile pit or not. but even that doesn't like have a major impact on what's going to happen. So why are there choices, right? What are those choices doing? Well, I think what they're doing is they are asking you to be a part of a performance. That really is sort of the way that I try to think of this myself. It's my theory of what I'm doing. You're sort of put into this role of this guy called Calaf, who is, especially at the beginning of the game, pretty much of a jerk, like a very shallow character. And maybe he has some potential, but it's not coming out at the beginning of the game. And so you're sort of trading jokes with your friend. And that's sort of what your life is like. And so at the beginning, you're kind of like, oh, often maybe like, what is the best joke? Or something like that might be the way that you choose these dialogue options. And then, of course, at a certain point, you meet Turandot, and this is what it's all about, right? It's all about this interaction with Turandot. And Turandot really asks you to perform. I mean, she is performing herself. She is all about performance, about like rising to the occasion, bringing it all up to an aesthetic and dramatic and even humorous level that is sort of worthy of her. And now it's up to you to perform and be worthy of that performance. That's maybe one of the reasons to think of this. And so could that work as a short story? I think so. I mean, I've been toying with the idea that you could turn this into a short story. So I think you could do that, but it would be a very different experience, right? It would be reading that short story would be very different from playing the interactive fiction game. And I think that in the case of Turandot, it might be worthwhile too. So I don't think that this is the kind of story that could like only be told as an interactive fiction. But the choice of medium is definitely going to make a big difference on how you experience it. And so, I mean, in the end, the question of why did you write it as an interactive fiction is mostly because that's the medium I'm most comfortable with, and something like that. Not something too deep. But I think the important thing is not, well, why did I make that choice? The important thing is what changes when you turn it from one thing into something else. And I think this is what changes, right? Either you are the reader who is, seeing the author do something, or the author is there asking you, hey, come and stage this thing with me. Here's your role, play. And that's different.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that was actually really fun that you put such an emphasis on the performance part of it, because when I was playing, I actually noticed that after a while, I got into that performance part of it. Like,
Yes.
I was starting, there was a shift in the way I read my options and what had happened beforehand, and what I took into account to make a decision, how I would respond. And like, at first I was just sort of trying to roleplay. I was trying to be Calaf. And then at some point that switched into, and then it was really interesting. Like, I can't even really pinpoint when it happened and what exactly it turned into. But there were several switches where I really realized another level, basically, of the medium itself and how that offers you different options of interacting with it. And yeah, I remember wondering at some point whether it really mattered what I said. But after a while, I figured maybe not. And then I just started having fun with it. And that's when it really sort of blossomed for me. That's when
and so it matters, but it doesn't matter in the way that you've been taught to think that choices in games ought to matter, right? Yeah. Because we've been taught, I think, that a choice matters if it makes a difference in the outcome. But in fact, maybe a choice matters because it is the making of the choice that matters.
Yes.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and I think that really an example of me playing the game came to mind as well is this switch that happened. In the beginning I was kind of trying to roleplay as Calaf, and maybe me and like we play Dungeons and Dragons together, so it's also like the role player in me that wanted to, okay, this is a role playing game, this is a character, so I should play that character. But eventually, in the crocodile pit, it was there came an option.
Really, something happened.
Then I was like, no, actually, I do not want to die. That wasn't me role playing as Calaf anymore, but that was me like, no,
keep going.
I actually
I am
don't
not
want to
done
fall
yet.
into this crocodile pit.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try and escape. I think halfway through, somewhere along there, a switch turned and it really became this performance. I think that captured it really well.
I'm really glad to hear that. I mean, if I think, I don't know whether I ever explicitly thought about this in this way, but if you think about how the game is structured, like this crocodile pit is like, it is so theatrical, right? The entire setting is so theatrical that you are really being, I mean, that's the moment where I hope it sort of becomes clear to you that yeah, I mean, you have to embrace this theatricality. If you want to embrace Turandot, because there's no difference between embracing Turandot and embracing the theatricality. And then at the end of the game, when you get into when you get into this riddle scene, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. I mean, this riddle scene like ramps the theatricality up to 11. And you must already be there, right? If you're not into the theatricality at the point of the riddle scene, then it makes no sense, that it falls flat. But okay, if you are there, then it is also the scene that sort of allows you to, okay, yes, this works. I mean, these two people actually do, which is crazy because it can't work. I mean, okay, so let me say a little bit about the opera, which I started from. I mean, if you think that's interesting.
Absolutely, for sure.
Okay, so here's the opera. And I think it's not just an opera. It was also, I think, a play by Schiller, and it was a fairy tale. But okay, I mean, it's most famous as an opera by Puccini, so the 1920s, I think. And here's the story of the opera. There's this guy called Calaf, and he is a very noble guy. I mean, he's not like the Calaf in my Turandot at all. I mean, he is this noble prince. At least he's supposed to be a noble prince. And he comes to China, to the Chinese court, and there he meets his long-lost father, because they've been kicked out of their kingdom by some usurper. And he meets his long-lost father and a slave girl, Liu, who has been taking care of his father. And they're really, really happy that they found each other again. And who cares about the kingdom they've lost? At least they're back together. In the meantime, some guy is being beheaded. Right? Why? Well, because he wanted to marry Turandot, and he failed her test. And the test is answer 3 riddles. And so Calaf hears about that and he says, oh, maybe we should get out of here because this Turandot sounds like bad news. And then Turandot appears on the balcony to see the beheading. And of course, Calaf falls head over heels in love with her. And he himself rings the gong and says, I want to try the riddles. Okay. And so Act 2 is the riddle scene. And here we have like these 2 characters, and one of them is a princess who beheads people when they can't answer her riddles. I mean, what kind of person is that? And on the other hand, there is this Calaf guy who falls head over heels in love with that person, even though he could also be marrying this Liu girl who is clearly the best woman in the world. So what is supposed to happen? Okay, so he gets the riddles. And now there are 2 things that can happen. If he doesn't get the riddles right, he dies. But we're only halfway through the opera, right? So that can't happen. So he has to get the riddles right. Okay, so he gets the riddles right. Now Turandot has to marry him. But she hates him, right? She is the kind of woman who wants to behead all men because she hates them all. What's he going to do, right? Is he going to marry her? I mean, what's that like? That's like, oh, okay, you lost. I don't want to get married. Yeah, you promised. That's not like a positive ending to the opera. So what is Puccini to do? And I think there's really no way out, right? There's really no way out. And so what actually happens in the opera is that, I guess the librettist, right, the guy who wrote the text, thinks, okay, I've got to play for time. And so what he does is Calaf says to the princess, well, princess, don't worry. I am going to give you an entire night. And if during that night you can find out my name, you can behead me. And if not, we're going to marry. And that doesn't really seem to solve anything, but at least it gives us a little bit of time, right? And it gives Calaf the time to sing the most famous aria from the history of opera, Nessun Dorma, Nessun Dorma, well, whatever. Which is nobody sleeps. That's what it means. Nobody sleeps. Why? Well, because the princess has told the entire city that they have to find out what this guy is called during this night, and otherwise she's gonna behead them all. And so there's this little choir in the background singing, "Oh no, we're all gonna be beheaded," while Calaf is singing, "Nobody sleeps, and in the morning you're gonna marry me." And it's like crazy. I mean, how are you gonna solve this? Okay, somebody finds out that Liu knows Calaf. Like this slave girl knows Calaf, and so Turandot comes and takes Liu and says, "I'm gonna torture you until you tell me what that guy is called." And Liu says, "Oh no, I'd rather die," and then she dies. And then Calaf says, "Wow, I still love you, but you are really a terrible person." And somehow he sort of grabs her and kisses her, and she realizes that actually she's been in love with him all this time. And that's the end, and it's like terrible, right? I mean, the music is great, and that's why it's a really it's a really great opera. But the story is crap. So that was sort of, I was fascinated by this, and so I was fascinated by the question: okay, if you have this princess who beheads people, and you have a guy who falls in love with her, how are you ever gonna get them together in a way that works? And so that was sort of what fascinated me and what I wanted to sort of work out and make happen. And that is, I think, that plus the sort of vision of Turandot looking down at Calaf hanging above a crocodile pit. Those were the two ingredients that turned into Turandot the story. Which I mean, now that I've told you the story, you can see is in many ways very, very, very different from the opera.
Yes, because
it does kind of try to solve the problem of the opera.
So you try to solve the problem of this guy falling in love with this murderous princess who beheads people, and vice versa, by actually in your story letting her build a super deadly murder dungeon in which she has crocodile pits and giants who kill people.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, one of the reviewers of Turandot, and I love this review, says, this dungeon is a metaphor for the terrifying work of self-knowledge, right? For getting to know who you are. And I think, well, I hope he's right. I mean, because that is really what I wanted it to be. It's like both Calaf and Turandot, in their interaction in this dungeon, find out who they are, right? And that is something that doesn't really seem to happen in the opera, and that's in part because the emphasis in the opera is all on this riddle scene, which is like there's nothing there. I mean, he gets the riddles or he dies. I mean, what's it doing there? And so I decided to put the riddle scene at the end of my game, where it can have a totally different narrative role.
Yeah,
and actually matters.
And the riddles are actually from the opera.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Fun fact.
Yeah, that's funny. Because it's funny how the riddles also, when you play them, they don't matter. In the sense that you know that, okay, you can't, in the second one, for example, I mean, if people want to play this, I don't think it is a spoiler because you see it. In the second one, you can't even choose the right answer. The right answer is actually on screen, but you can't click it.
Actually enjoyed that when you did that earlier in the game, when she invites you into the dungeon and it's like your conscience telling you, no, don't do this, you're gonna die.
Yeah.
But yet, you know, you've fallen under her spell, you will do anything.
Turandot. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so that is, I think, one of the interesting things about choices, And this is something that you could not replicate in a short story, by the way. That the choices that there are, no matter what they are, even if they are grayed out, make a difference to what is going on.
They're there. You will see them as player/reader.
It's the simple fact that these are all possibilities and that these are all the possibilities tells you a lot about who this guy is.
Yeah. And I think it's super interesting how you say that it's Kalaf getting to understand himself in the dungeon, but of course, it being interactive fiction, it is actually
you as player,
us understanding our player, reader, whatever, I don't know, both. Chooser maybe, us understanding our role in the story, because that's what I think we both expressed that we experienced is at this point becoming like this. It becomes this intuitive performance.
Yes. Also felt like leading up to that, it was a very big process of exploration, basically. Who am I? What am I doing here? How am I playing this game? How am I,
I mean, you're just thrown in the middle of things.
Exactly.
With a pre-made character. And in many ways, that's very different from how most role-playing games approach things, right? A sense as pen and paper role-playing games maybe almost necessarily. I mean, I guess there are some examples where you get a kind of pre-made character, but in general, I mean, you are thinking up this character and you're going to form them during the game. But also the vast majority of computer role-playing games sort of try to give you a lot of options, especially when it comes to your character, right? In the sense of the character of your character. Who is this person? What makes them tick? What kind of choices would they make? And that is something that can work because it gives you this freedom to role play, as you say. But it also, I think it's very limiting as a writer, because now you have to write this story where that can be played by anyone. And of course, I mean, in these AAA role-playing games, you can see at a very simple scale already. I mean, you can like often play good or evil, right? And then they sort of have to tell a story that makes sense for both a good and an evil player. And usually it's a story that makes a lot of sense for a good player because you end up saving the world. And then they have to think up some like forceful reasons why an evil player character would do the same things. But certainly the story can't depend on like the subtleties of your characterization, because if that's what the story is going to depend on, they will have to write 100 stories, and you can't do that. So you're kind of limited in. I mean, the more freedom you give the player to choose different roles, the more limited you are in how much of a role the character can play in the story. And I think that is one of the reasons that so many computer role-playing games have these really terrible. Oh no, the world has to be saved and you are the only one with the ability to do it. Go and do it story, which is, I mean, I guess it's a story, but it's the kind of story that hasn't been informed by having good characters at all.
Yeah, it's more plot. You do this.
Yeah,
it would be.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure. You just get caught up in it, and obviously you're gonna save the world.
Yeah, duh.
Yeah,
you're saving the world.
Like
duh.
And I think the better. So a game like something that we mentioned, a game like The Witcher 3, actually has a lot of characterization built in. Right? There's you cannot play Geralt of Rivia as a jovial, fun-loving guy.
No, it's like
or as somebody who is completely evil and doesn't want to help people. I mean, it's pretty limited.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why it works pretty well, I think, the story.
Yeah, and even within the character of Geralt, you can still choose a lot of things in options in the Witcher. I mean, sometimes
but they all sort of fit the same character, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you get to choose whether to, I don't know, pursue this person who is also a monster and kill them, or sort of make a deal with them that they won't hurt any more people or something like that. And it sort of both fits. But you are not going to be given the option to help him to destroy the entire village, because that doesn't fit the character at all, right? And I think that's a good choice. So I think I am extremely skeptical of this ideology where people say, well, you've got to be able to do whatever you want, play whatever you wish. I mean, you can do that, but there's a very big narrative cost.
I agree. Yeah, I think the only way you could possibly hope to leverage something like that, or at least make sure that within the narrative itself it's accounted for, is in a scenario such as D&D, where you have a DM who can think on their feet and make new decisions. But the limitation of a computer game and the programming that comes with it is, of course, that you have a limited option, a limited number of options of possible consequences that your actions and your choices can have. And I also think that's beautiful in Geralt, that they included that possibility that Geralt, as a Witcher, he can kill monsters, he will kill monsters, but he doesn't necessarily think that monsters are monstrous. And in that gray area, you as a player are given that opportunity to express yourself and be a good guy in a very dark and cruel world, basically.
Good guy.
Good guy, yeah. I mean,
Kind of good guy. Kind of good. It's generally good
sort of
news
nice.
if Geralt has been somewhere. So yeah, I think like there's a world of difference between a computer role playing game and a pen and paper role playing game, and like the difference is, or maybe ought to be, but this is a normative claim that I'm going to make about pen and paper role playing games. Is that computer role playing games, you are playing somebody's story, right? The story that was written by these writers. And in a pen and paper role playing game, it's story now, right? It's story being co-created, which is, and here's the normative claim, why I think that like pen and paper RPG scenarios that come with a story built in are the worst idea ever.
Kind of defeats its own purpose, which is to have that creative freedom to do what you want. If you already put a story with it.
Okay, so I should maybe de-emphasize that a little bit, because I mean, in a game like D&D, that's a game that sort of the rules are really built around like combat encounters, and those actually require a lot of preparation from the game master. So you need some kind of way to streamline things. And you're sort of left to find out what to do with the narrative, I think, which is okay, right? I mean, as a group, you can choose to just do the dungeon, or you can choose to, whatever, have some role-playing fun. But the D&D books are not really there to help you very much with that.
No.
Not at all.
I tend to play, when I play pen and paper role-playing games. Well, actually, I've played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, but mostly I tend to play like these narrative-focused games that if you try as a game master to think of the story in advance, then you've already ensured that it's going to be a dismal failure, right? That are really built on the idea that the story is going to happen when you're there at the table and not beforehand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this pen and paper role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons involves you with people, well, let's call them friends for the time being.
For convenience.
Who knows? Let's call them friends. I mean,
hopefully, are around the table, and you are all, in a sense, in a similar way to what you described it in Turandot, is that you are all establishing a world through a kind of performance. How would you see those similarities in the two, and also the differences? Because there probably are differences.
Yeah. So let's assume for a moment a kind of role-playing game where at least most of the players sort of take control of a single character, right? And are sort of asked to kind of step into the shoes of that character. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is not an across-the-board truth about role-playing games, but let's assume that for a moment, because it's closest to the kind of thing that we find in a game like Turandot. So I think it is immediately I mean, of course. I mean, one difference is that in a game like Turandot, you have this list of options, right? And in the role playing game, like the pen and paper role playing game, you have no list of options, and you can basically choose whatever you want, and you can sort of choose whatever you want as long as it fits within the narrative parameters of the game that you're supposed to be playing, right? And so if you are playing a game like Dungeons and Dragons and your game master comes with a beautiful dungeon and a guy who gives you a quest, then saying, well, actually, what I want to do is play chess with the other players for the rest of the evening is pretty rude. Okay, so there are some limitations there. But you're you can kind of do what you want. And so you have more options. But I think what is also very important is that this immediately generates completely different expectations. Right? If a game master tries to run a pen and paper session the way that Turandot unfolds, like totally on rails, which in Turandot is like it's almost literally on rails because you're actually walking through this linear dungeon, right? But so totally on rails, where it doesn't really matter what you say or do because the next step in the story is going to be the same anyway. That works very well in a game like Turandot. I mean, you've bought into that, right? That's what you're doing. That's the thing. And you enjoy the way that you interact with it. In a pen and paper game, that is the worst, right? You start out as friends at the beginning of the evening, but you're no longer friends at the end of it because, man, this game master, he was railroading you, as the term of abuse would be in the role-playing community. So like the same kind of interaction is completely different because the expectations are completely different. The fact that the game master is not a computer program makes a difference in what the game master can do, but also in what the game master ought to do. Because you know that you are interacting with another human being and you want them to take account of what you're doing in the way that they can take account of what you're doing. And so this is why thinking up a story beforehand and then trying to shepherd your players along with it is the worst possible thing you could do as a game master in a role-playing game.
Strong statement. I do think I disagree, but
that's okay. Well, no, you are right to disagree because it is a generalization that doesn't apply to all role-playing games. So in fact, in a game like Dungeons and Dragons, this can actually work pretty well because you know where the area of, I mean, I have, like the last time I played Dungeons and Dragons, this was 4th edition, and we played a sort of like dungeon crawling series of sessions. And we were all totally clear about the fact that the game master had this pre-made booklet with stuff in it. And we were going to follow the story to the next battle. And that's where your freedom started, right? I mean, we were there for the tactical board game, if you want. And fourth edition is the most tactical board game of all D&D editions.
The bane of my existence.
Yeah, I liked it. But I mean, so the reason that I liked it is that, and you are going to hate me for this, is that I think that is what D&D was made for. Because if I want to tell a story, I'm going to pick a different role-playing game from my closet. Because, I mean, if you open up D&D, it's 500 pages of monster stats and weapons and spells, and it's all pieces for your tactical board game. And so if you're not going to use it as a tactical board game, maybe you shouldn't have like these 3 fat books with those 500 pages of numerical stats. Okay, but that's possibly a controversial take.
Yeah, well, me as a dungeon master, as a game master, my solution to that is mostly I not really knowing the rules of it anyway.
We make it up as we go.
So one like if there would be a D&D veteran at my table that would really be a rules freak, they would probably not like my table because my game is more narrative focused. And combat, we don't use tactical grid. It's mostly like you call it theater of the mind. It's just I describe someone there. Someone asks me, "Oh, how far away is that?" And I'm like, 30 feet. So But I think in our game, that's it's to call it a social contract between you and the players. That's the way it goes.
Yeah.
So, but
Actually,
yeah,
this
I think
role-playing theorists do talk about the social contract. Absolutely, all the time.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. That sounds very logical. Yeah. So it's the Dungeons and Dragons does have those more combat focused things, and but on the other hand, that does leave you a lot of room for the other stuff, which for a lot of people is a lot of work, which also for me is a lot of work, but also I like putting all that work in it on the role playing encounters, and that stuff is more of the actual free balling. Then like you can say whatever you want. Yeah. And if I hopefully have made a good character, they would respond in a realistic fashion, and that would just go. That would be like this performance establishing a world again, and that's pretty free, hopefully. And yeah, but D&D doesn't provide us a framework for it. That's for sure.
Right. So if we're like at some point in the as yet indeterminate future, we're going to have a long conversation about different kinds of role-playing systems.
Yes,
I would enjoy that a lot. Because that is my other passion. Well, not my other passion, but one of my other passions.
I have two passions.
Well, actually, three. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, philosophy, role-playing games,
and
interactive fictions.
Yeah, that's it.
Yes, it's Victor Gijsbers' life confirmed here. You heard it here first.
Yeah, you hear it. Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe we can round it off a bit. Is there anything you still want to get off your chest before I?
Is there something I want to get off my chest? Well, if people have been listening to this and they think, "Hey, I want to check out some interactive fiction," you can search for interactive fiction, and maybe the best place to start is the interactive fiction competition website. Like play some high-ranking interactive fiction competition games. They're generally good.
Such as
Turandot.
Such as
Turandot. As Turandot, I don't want to blow my own
high-ranking games indeed.
I didn't win, so
well, second place. So I mean, second place is as close to winning as you can get.
If you're not winning.
Yeah, unless you're in first place. That is closer to winning, because that actually is winning.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
Are you then still close to winning though? It's
I don't know. Yeah, that's the closest you can get to winning without actually getting there. That's
exactly.
So
joint first place, is that?
Ooh.
Is it really a first place then? I think people who actually get a joint first place would be
I think this is the moment where we have descended into philosophy.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yeah, we should get out.
It's been a while. I honestly thought this moment would come sooner.
Yeah, is it philosophy, or is this just pedantry?
It's don't know. What's bickering about words and what's the difference between
exactly. So then, last question, which we are gonna ask every professor, is sort of a recurring thing.
Oh boy.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm very nervous now.
Don't worry, your life won't depend on it, much like as in Turandot. So I'm gonna name 3 philosophers, and you can choose 3 options. So you gotta match each of the philosophers with one of the options. One of the philosophers you can choose to have a nice night and get drunk with. One of the philosophers you can choose to live together with for a long while. And one of these philosophers you can choose to punch in the face.
Oh man, it's a fucking philosophy.
I'm not really the punching type, but give him to me.
Okay, so the philosophers I came up with would be Kant, Immanuel Kant, David Hume, and Hegel.
Kant, Hume, and Hegel. So, okay. Do I just have to give an answer, or can I think about it a little bit first?
Oh, you can think about it out loud.
Okay,
Yes,
so
out
I mean,
loud,
when
please.
it comes to living with people for a long time, I think like apparently Hume and Kant were both kind of nice guys to be around. Right? Hume was apparently pretty sociable. Kant. Now, I think Kant he gave like these big lunches and invited lots of friends, but I think Kant would really want to live alone. I don't think he would like somebody else in the house with him, like outside those lunch hours. So, but I a lot of questions I want to ask Kant because I've really delved into his thinking. So I'm gonna choose a night in the pub with Kant. I'm gonna choose to live with you because I think it could be kind of comfortable, though we would have to have a few uncomfortable discussions about racism somewhere along the line. And I mean, I really have no reason to punch Hegel in the face, but I just haven't delved into Hegel very much yet. So I think I'll punch him in the face and say, sorry, this is what I wasn't really free. Something like that. Yeah, but I am sorry, Hegel.
I lost it there with Kant.
Yeah, I had to choose.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So thank you very much for coming on our first
it was a great pleasure.
Podcast. Yeah, thank you very much. I had a lot of fun talking with you about interactive fiction for a bit.
Yeah.
People do check it out if it sounds interesting to you. I had fun. So maybe you will too.
Anyone who hears this is already listening.
This is true.
Well, thank you very much for coming.